Hi, everybody. I'm going to hope that people can see my slides. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm very flattered to have been invited on behalf of YC. We'll hopefully have some advice that's helpful for some of you. By way of background, as Kat said, I'm a physician and have spent the last year and a half with Y Combinator, working with many of the bio companies that have come through. So over the course of that time, probably over 100 companies I've had the pleasure of working with. In the past, I was a drug developer at a bunch of big pharmaceutical companies. I then decided that the best way to create new things that matter is to do it yourself, and started Assembly Biosciences to try and cure hepatitis B, and have also recently started another biotech company called Pardes Bio, working on another virus that many of us care about. As Kat mentioned, at YC, they have funded a lot of startups. Over 2,000 startups, and that includes over 300 deep tech and biotech startups. And if you think about it, that actually makes YC one of the largest seed stage bio and tech investors in the world, which is kind of remarkable given the fact that that is something that YC started funding relatively late. As Kat mentioned, how does it work at YC? YC funds you. We try to help you during as well as after the batch. And we try to help you raise money, the lifeblood of every startup. It looks like YC's been pretty successful with that. Overall, they have helped companies create over $200 billion in value. And the bio and hard tech component of that is actually over $10 billion. So it's really nice to see that it's not just the software companies, it's also the hard tech companies that are doing extraordinarily well. Kat mentioned some of the companies that you probably already know, including Alpaca, which just raised $10 million Series A, as well as the Airbnbs and the Dropboxes. But there's some other companies that we think you should know about as well. For example, Atomwise in the computational chemistry space, and 64X in the synthetic biology space. We have companies like Boom Aerospace, who we'll talk about a little bit more later, Epic Aerospace making space tugs, Prometheus in the energy space, and Rigetti Computing doing quantum computers. Pretty much you can think of. As Kat mentioned, we fund all types of companies, from digital health to diagnostics, synthetic biology, therapeutics, small molecules, large molecules, quantum computers, even spaceships. And this brings up a question that I've had asked many times. How can you do this for a hard tech company or a biotech company? Because biotech is different, or nanotech is different, or diagnostics are different, or supersonic aircraft are different. And because we are so different, how much of the standard YC advice actually applies to me? So in response to this, one of the partners, Jared Friedman, went through the startup school curriculum and looked to see, even in startup school, how much of the YC advice applies. And it turns out that a lot of the advice works extremely well for a lot of companies, particularly at the seed stage, because everybody cares. How do you plan your minimal viable product? How do you define that? How are investors going to think about you? What does it mean to build culture as a startup? How do you evaluate if your idea is a good one? How do you talk to investors about it? How do you talk to users? These are all things that matter whether you're a biotech or a software company. You need to know what your goals are. And I'm pretty sure that biotech companies, as well as software companies and hardware companies, all want to become $100 billion companies. Despite this, we often get asked, well, that's all fine and nice, but our ideas are different because our ideas take a lot of money and software companies don't. And I think this is because people are thinking about these types of fundraisers, the $50 million, multi-million-dollar Series A, which ends up being really frightening. If you're looking at this massive wall, how do you get over it? And as a result, people don't even get started because they're intimidated by this massive hurdle. And it's true that bio and hard tech can take a lot of money, but that actually misses the point. And so this is probably the first piece of advice in the talk. Rather than asking how much money do you need to get to your final endpoint, you really need to be asking how much money do you need to fund and start the company. So advice number one, get started and think about here. And when you think about that part, it's very, very different. I will strongly recommend to everyone to read a blog post that Jared wrote on the YC blog, how biotech startup funding will change over the next 10 years. And what's amazing is that biotech startups today actually look pretty similar to the way some software startups used to look a long time ago. You can start a biotech company today with a credit card from your garage. And so another way to think about fundraising is to think about it as a series of steps instead of a massive wall. And YC helps you with those first steps. It turns out you can do some really amazing things on a relatively small amount of money. What YC does is try to help you figure out how to do those things in a short period of time and to build the milestones that allow you, as Kat said, to have a demonstration, to have a presentation at demo day where you will then go on to raise your seed money or more seed money in many cases. And if needed, go on to your Series A, Series B, IPO. Turns out this is actually the way a lot of companies used to do it. Milestone-based funding is not a new idea, it's an old one. And there is a huge feature to being able to raise in pieces as opposed to huge amounts of money at once. It turns out this gives you a lot of flexibility. If people give you a large check at one point in time, you have very little ability to pivot. But if you are building things in steps, then you have the ability to pivot as necessary, which is incredibly important for a startup. So advice number two, pick your milestones very, very carefully, and that will help you articulate the vision as to where you are raising money to. I'll go a little bit further and say, as the ex-president of YC mentioned, Sam Altman, in many ways, it's easier to start a hard company than an easy company. And frankly, that means that even though you need to raise more money, it's also easier to raise it. And that hasn't been fully internalized by a lot of people, because what this demands is that you have a very ambitious idea. And what we see is that a lot of the applications to YC are for ideas that are not hugely ambitious. And we think there's a reason for that. We think it's because being ambitious is scary, and starting any kind of company is intimidating. And it seems if you're gonna try to do something which is small and simple, that will be easier, like a mobile shopping app. But weirdly, it only seems that way because if you're going out and raising money to cure cancer, turns out a lot more people want to help you cure cancer than to build another mobile shopping app. And here's another key point of advice, as Kat mentioned, we really like big ideas. So in terms of applying to YC, and which we encourage all of you to do, the bigger the idea and the better expressed, the more interesting it will be, not only to us, but I imagine to you as well. So moving to some other advice, sometimes the best lessons actually come from the examples of others. So I wanted to give you a few examples from some of the previous YC companies in the hard tech and biotech space. You may have heard of Boom from 2016. Boom wanted to build supersonic airplanes. The CEO, Blake, prior to Boom, was working on internet coupons at a company called Groupon. And he's been quoted as saying that there's a few things that make you want to focus on things you really love more than that type of experience. So he decided to focus on building something he truly wanted, and that was supersonic airplanes. And he did. He not only started a supersonic jet company, YC funded them. And in a few short years, they've just announced their first jet. They are the first independent supersonic jet designed, I think, in 50 years. Another big idea is spaceflight. Relativity Space, also from 2016, was founded by two aerospace engineers, domain experts who had been building rockets since college. And they had another big idea. Let's build and design and fly our own rockets, our own 3D printed rockets. Like I said, we like very big ideas. So when they applied, they had been working on this for a couple of months and had an idea and a spreadsheet. They've gone on to build the largest 3D metal printer in the world. Sorry, there are questions in the background. And that sounds impressive. It's more impressive to see it. I hope the video is coming through. They've gone on to raise over $140 million to build things like this. And those rockets are even more impressive, and to my mind, when you see them fire. So this is, again, people who applied with an idea and a spreadsheet. It turns out it's much easier to show cool pictures for hard tech than for biotech. So you'll have to forgive me that the bio pictures aren't as pretty. But I think they are a good example of the same idea. There's this myth that you need deep connections and experience to get a company up and running. It's just frankly not true. You have to have a really good idea, however. So Thomas, the CEO of Exception, became aware of a really big problem. And what made it extremely interesting is it was a problem that most people weren't aware of, that there are these proteins that are impossible for people to make, except for the fact that he had figured out how to make them. And so instead of a postdoc, he decided to start a company. He literally went to Google and typed, "How do I start a company?" And YC Startup School was one of the top hits. So he went through the online YC Startup School and applied to the next batch with a proof of concept that he had achieved with under $1,000, making a protein in 2 weeks that 2 academic labs had not been able to make in over 4 years. They then have gone on to repeat that with multiple big pharmaceutical companies being able to show that they can do things in weeks that other people had failed to do for years. They raised $1.5 million or so out of YC and have subsequently gone on prior to their A round, having again started this instead of a postdoc, to raise at valuations, I think most recently was somewhere over $50 million, and this is prior to their A round. Thomas will be one of the first people to say that his idea of how to build this as a company has also changed several times, and that it's the flexibility of raising in stages which has allowed them to be so successful. Asher Bio is a company that will be speaking tomorrow, and they're at a different place in terms of where the founders started from. These were two experienced scientists who'd been working at multiple big pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer. They were deep domain experts, but they saw that big pharma is doing things a certain way, and they thought they could do it better. So they applied to YC with some papers and a good idea, and left very stable jobs in a very big company to build better immunotherapies for cancer. When they started, they had no lab, no reagents, and no other people. And this, I think, speaks to the myth of you need a lot of money to get things done. Again, in bio, particularly where people imagine the $50 million A's, it's amazing. In less than 10 weeks and for under $100,000, they went from an idea to a proof of concept to cure cancer in an animal model. So with that, let me have just a couple of moments to give some very specific bio advice. You heard Kat say that at YC, we recommend that you write code and talk to users. And that's appropriate if you're a tech company writing code. For the bio companies, run the killer study and talk to users. There is an experiment that makes a huge difference. What is that experiment? Know it, do it up front, because that's going to show that you really understand what it is that defines the question that makes you different. Talking to users is the same, except the users can be different depending on the company. Are these going to be patients? What does an oncology patient want? Is this going to be a drug company? Are you building a therapeutic? Are you building a diagnostic? Are you building a tool for a big pharma? The next piece of advice is be ambitious. So you've heard me say this a few minutes ago. It's important to reiterate this. This is not a grant application. This is how you are going to change the world. So don't be conservative when you apply. Tell us, how are you going to change the world? And the most important thing, and the reason why entrepreneurship is so fantastic, you get to tell us why the world is better if what you build works. There's an extremely important 80-20 rule. Many of you have heard of the 80-20 rule, I'm certain, but what is it that you can do for 20% of the effort and the time and the money that can get you 80% of the way to an inflection point? If you understand that, then you really understand how to raise money and how to use that money efficiently. That goes hand in hand with knowing what are your inflection points. It's very hard to get someplace if you don't know where you're going. If you understand the places that show that your technology is making a difference, you understand where you need to raise money to get to. Now, granted, in some cases, this is very hard. For example, supersonic aircraft, but it's still possible. There are things that make it possible to show you understand your domain space. That is an inflection point. Show why you're going to win. But if you're going to show where and how and why you're going to win, you have to believe in that. And that means you need to go all in. This is particularly an issue with some of the academic founders that we've worked with, where people want to stay with one foot in one world and one foot in another. And the question that always comes up is, if you don't believe in it, why should somebody else? If you really believe that what you're making is going to change the world, you're going to cure cancer, you're going to cure coronavirus, you're going to help people live healthier, longer lives, you're going to build a space rocket for pennies on the dollar, and that will be $1 billion company, then why are you doing something that is not as fantastic as the world you are painting in your startup's eye? So with that said, as Kat mentioned, we would love to see more fantastic applications from Japanese founders, and we strongly encourage that you apply when the time is right for you. There's no application deadline. We continue to read applications up until the start of the batch. And particularly for hard tech and for biotech founders, people wonder, when should I apply? Well, you can apply whenever, if it's just an idea, as you heard us say, or if you've launched, if you have users, if you have revenue, if you're selling diagnostics or products, or trying to figure out how to do that. Just filling out the application turns out to be extremely helpful. Every application is read. If you have any questions, I'll again put up the email. Please check out the FAQ on ycombinator.com or shoot an email to apply at ycombinator.